Boa tarde, good afternoon. Primeiro eu farei uma curta apresentação em português e logo em seguida em inglês, que será a língua oficial da mesa de hoje. First, I will present a small general explanation about the event in Portuguese, then we go finally to start our English event. Sou professor adjunto em Geografia Política do Departamento de Geografia da Universidade de Brasília e hoje meu papel é fazer mediação de uma mesa que muito me orgulho. Hoje é o terceiro dia do ciclo de debates do IV CONGEO. Quem ainda não conhece, o CONGEO é o maior evento de geografia política do Brasil e acontece bianualmente. Esse ano, o evento seria realizado presencialmente na FRJ, no Rio de Janeiro, porém a pandemia nos obrigou a criar uma estratégia para não abandonar o evento. Buscando alguma coisa boa nesse contexto tão complicado, aproveitamos e criamos esse ciclo de debates, com 4 mesas em línguas distintas, com professores internacionais convidados. Vocês podem acompanhar nesse canal a primeira mesa, realizada em português, com o professor João Ferrão, da Universidade de Lisboa, e o professor Rubem Gonzalez, da Universidade de Santiago de Compostela. Na semana passada, a mesa espanhol teve como presença o professor Cudberto Hernandes, da Universidade Nacional Autônoma do México, na Cidade do México. Teremos também como convidado o professor Mário Valério Martínez, da Universidade de Los Andes, na Venezuela, mas por questões de dificuldades logísticas, infelizmente, ele não pôde estar presente. Hoje, eu tenho a honra de receber 2 importantes professores de Geografia Política, reconhecidos mundialmente por estudiosos do campo, oriundos da State University of Ohio, professor Kevin Cox, da Exter University, professor Clive Barnett, da Inglaterra. Esses são 2 nomes obrigatórios para quem se interessa pelos estudos que relacionam a geografia e política. A palestra será completamente em inglês, porém, posteriormente, o vídeo será legendado e disponibilizado para todos no YouTube. Os 2 textos que os professores usarão como base para essa apresentação estão postados no blog, chamado Observatório de Geografia Política, para quem quiser acompanhar com mais facilidade. Está aqui o nome embaixo, o link do blog. Quem quiser entrar lá, os 2 textos dos professores estão disponíveis para acesso. Perguntas em inglês ou português podem ser colocadas no chat e serão feitas ao final da apresentação dos 2 palestrantes. Para apresentar um pouco melhor o evento, eu convido a professora Ináiles de Castro, coordenadora geral desse evento, para nos falar rapidamente. Iná, tá mudo.
Yes, I know. Now, I just named of the organizing committee of this event to want to welcome to Professor Clive Barnett and Professor Kevin Cox, that I had the pleasure to meet a few years ago in another event organized by Stéphane Rosière in France. That will be with us next week. Next week, Rosière will be with us. Well, we appreciate very much our presence at our Political Jobs Congress and wish good work. Well, now I return the word to the moderator of this session, Professor Daniel Azevedo, and thanks again for being among us. I don't want to take the time of your presentation anymore. Thank you very much.
So now a little presentation in English about the event. Welcome, professors, Professor Clive Barnett and Professor Kevin Cox. Now I'll give a small presentation about the event in English, then you can finally start. I'm Daniel Azevedo, Professor of Political Geography in Brasília University, and today I'm honored to be the moderator of this virtual debate with 2 great political geographers. Today is the 3rd day of 4th CONGEO virtual debates. For those people who doesn't know it, CONGEO is the biggest political geography event in Brazil and happens each 2 years. In 2020, this problematic year, the event would happen in Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, but the pandemic crisis made us to change it. So we invited international professors each week with different language. If you guys want, in this channel, you can see our Portuguese debate with Professor João Ferrão from Lisbon University and Professor Rubén González from Santiago de Compostela University in Spain. Last week, in our Spanish panel, we invited Professor Cudberto Hernandes from Mexico City. We had also invited Professor Mario Martinez from Los Andes University in Venezuela, but we had logistic problems because Venezuela had a big blackout last week, so he wasn't with us. Today, we are honored having two political geography professors known worldwide by all of us from State University of Ohio in the US, Professor Kevin Cox, and from Exter University, England, Professor Clive Barnett. Those professors are mandatory names for who wants to study the relation between geography and politics. This lecture will be completely in English, but after we will subtitle in Portuguese, and it will be free in our YouTube channel for everybody who wants to hear and talk about it anytime. You can also ask questions to our guests in our chat below. I would like to thank both professors for accepting our invitation. I'm sure we will learn and enjoy your both lectures, and we hope this is an important moment of building an interesting network. I do think geographers need to talk more, think together, and develop our science together, beyond the limits of the language and the territories. I do hope this is our first attempt for this goal. We are going to start our meeting with Professor Clive Barnett from Exter University. Professor Barnett's works fall into the following areas: geographies of public life and space of democracy, social theory and changing cities. He's one of the editors of Progress in Human Geography Journal, editor of Hodled Research in Place, Space, and Politics. He's now a professor at Exter University, and his last amazing book, by the way, his last book is called The Priority of Injustice, as you can see here below. Professor Barnett also has an interesting blog called Pop Theory, as you can see also below. So thanks again. It's an honor having you here, Professor Barnett. You have around 40 minutes for your lecture. And I say again, thank you. And now it's with you.
Okay. Lovely. Thank you, Daniel, ever so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'm humbled, and I'm very aware that as before we started, we were having a brief conversation about. I'm of course going to be speaking in English to an audience for whom English is probably the second or third language, and I'm also speaking English, which is something you just all pointed out to me, that therefore I might be doubly, triply difficult to understand. So I'm going to read to the paper that I've submitted. I'll try and make that as least clunky as I can. I should also say, of course, that I'm going to talk to some of the implications of the argument made in the book that Daniel just meant, The Priority of Injustice. And I'm going to make reference to geography and human geography. Of course, when I do that, I'm broadly speaking, talking about the tradition I'm familiar with, kind of what you might think of as, well, not just Anglo-American geography, but kind of English-speaking, Anglophone geography. And I'm going to obviously simplify and make some assertions about that tradition and its different aspects. And it would be interesting for me to learn the degree to which things I have to say may or may not resonate with your communities. So anyway, that was my excuses to begin with. So my starting point is just an observation, really, that social justice has been a central theme, of course, of critical scholarship in human geography, in urban and regional studies, in planning theory, those sorts of fields, for, well, about 50 years, since the 1970s. That's an obvious kind of thing to say. Broadly speaking, I think it's true to say that geographers, spatial theorists, if one likes, have often been reluctant to specify the kind of content of what they mean by justice. That there's a tendency in geography and spatial disciplines, related spatial disciplines, to privilege practice as the arena in which values, the meanings of values like justice, actually emerge. So analytical attention in these sorts of fields, broadly speaking, geography, tends to be given to the investigation, the empirical investigation of explicit struggles against injustice. Radical scholarship, broadly speaking, in geography, has often expressed strong elective affinities with social movements struggling for justice. And it's been consistently, I think, wary and suspicious of normative political reasoning. I want to suggest then that the privileging of practice over theory when it comes to thinking and talking about values and norms in what are strongly empirical fields like geography and urban studies and so on, actually inadvertently reproduces a structure of thought in which justice continues to be thought of as an egalitarian ideal against which injustice shows up as an absence. So the standard way of thinking about justice and injustice is one including in geography, one tends to think that justice is some kind of ideal, and you can spot injustice in the world when you come across situations which diverge or deviate from that ideal situation of justice. The practical primacy then, according to expressed claims of injustice in geography and related fields, actually reproduces what might be most problematic about normative political philosophizing. It tends to actually reproduce a kind of highly authoritative, monological style of reasoning. Rather than constructing kind of ideal normative models, what happens in geography and related fields is a certain sort of authoritative reasoning is displaced onto either the claims made for explanatory theory or for certain sorts of ontologies. That's the thing I'm going to try and argue or talk to. So this sense that injustice is an egalitarian ideal from which injustice is an empirical departure is something you can find across different traditions of thought. You can find it in traditions of thought which are interested in developing alternative ontologies, strongly explanatory causal theories. You can also find it in all sorts of empirical fields in which kind of essentially amassing lots of empirical data about inequality is understood as being the equivalent of mapping injustice. So what I want to do here is follow the argument made in the book, The Priority of Injustice, about what is involved in not just giving practical, empirical primacy to injustice over ideals of justice, but what's involved in giving conceptual priority to injustice when you think about issues of democracy and politics in particular. When I say the priority of injustice, and specifically giving conceptual priority to injustice, what I'm referring to is the idea that one can and should theorize and think about injustice prior to and independent of having an ideal theory of justice. This is a theme you can see in various strands of political theory, which I talk about in the book. It involves really an intellectual shift from focusing on egalitarian ideals towards thinking about norms of non-domination. I'm not going to reproduce that argument here. I want to really kind of talk through why that argument might have some implications for how geographers think about what geography is good for. So the key aspect I want to pursue here around this theme of the priority of injustice is associated with the idea that the key emphasis in understanding political processes, particularly understanding, if you're interested in sort of thinking about the dynamics of democracy, is claims making, the making of claims. So the conceptual priority of injustice involves this intellectual focus upon processes and practices of making claims against domination, against exploitation, against oppression, and so on. Now, thinking of democracy and political action in terms of claims making might appear at first sight to support a view that we're familiar with, that the spaces of politics are to do with those classic spaces that geographers in particular and urban scholars as well like: the city, the street, the forum. It's also can easily be assumed to be associated with an image of politics as being all to do with protest and demonstration in certain sorts of public spaces. I want to argue then that giving conceptual priority to injustice actually should require us to rethink the spaces of politics away from those particular kind of privileged fields of kind of co-presence. And it should also lead us to rethink conventions of critique in spatial disciplines. So let's go back to the idea that lots of geography often is associated and draws from the idea that norms and principles and values, rather than being the object of something one should be theorizing about, you kind of should really kind of follow the norms and values which emerge from social movement struggles. You can see this theme in different strands of research, certainly in English language, Anglophone and geography. Research on environmental justice would be one example in which there's very strong associations between academic researchers aligned closely with social movement mobilizations and thinking through and spotting the emergent values that are used strategically by social movements. Similar kind of theme in research on the right to the city, likewise, very close to the ground kind of sense of that's where values and notions of justice emerge from. Now, I think the idea that critical analysis should be responsive to and attentive to the immanent values that express shared senses of injustice emerging from political struggles is clearly one which is important and should be valued. However, there are at least a couple of dangers or temptations that we might want to be aware of and then perhaps resist, which follow or might easily follow from that assumption. The first is the idea that you could, in a sense, reconstruct the meaning of justice by simply tracing the kind of empirical contents of social movement struggles or of political struggles. Secondly, there is this associated sense that actually critical analysis necessarily involves a close elective identification with certain favoured activist voices or with the interests of victims. Those are serious thoughts that one should entertain, but there might be problems with both of those ideas. The problem is really that they can lead one to miss the central conundrum that arises from any commitment to give primacy to expressions of injustice in thinking about politics. If one only attends to expressed claims of harm or injury or exploitation, then you can actually, of course, pass over or inadvertently ignore the ways in which one of the key ways in which injustice is done is effectively by silencing certain groups of people, by suppressing or repressing their capacity to express their experience of harm, injury, and exploitation. So the problem, if you like, of so-called epistemic injustice complicates any straightforward assertion that analytical attention should be given to the as it were, empirically visible expressions of injustice that one can find. So I'll come back to that issue. The practical primacy accorded to claims of injustice then in geography and related fields and critical spatial theory broadly perhaps is associated with, as I've suggested, a particular type of justification, a particular form of reasoning which underwrites a view of what critical spatial theory is good for. You can see this in debates about the urbanization of injustice, the right to the city, grammars of injustice. There's often a tendency to assume that when one can spot sort of social movement mobilizations or claims against injustice, we kind of already know what the causes of those claims are. We kind of know, surely, don't we, that injustice is caused by capitalist exploitation of labor and the environment, by neoliberal governance, by intersectional formations of sexualized, gender, racial oppression, by accumulation, by dispossession. Those are the things that geographers, spatial theorists theorize about, those causal dynamics. Now, I'm suggesting that inadvertently, or as it were unconsciously, what's going on is a certain sort of authoritative reasoning which you might associate with normative political theories, which geographers tend not to like, is actually being reproduced in a certain sort of authoritative form of monological reasoning about the causes of injustice. So what you have in lots of critical human geography is a focus overwhelmingly on, in some way or another, demonstrating, thinking that the purpose of spatial theory is to demonstrate that things could be different, that things are not as they first appear, that current arrangements are contingent and therefore could be changed. So one develops theories of the production of space, the assemblage of constituted orders, the formation of provisional settlements. At the same time, what you're asserting with, as you theorize those grand dynamics of power, are values of becoming, of openness, of contradiction, of paradox, which enable you to kind of hold open the possibility of changing things. So there's a certain style of critique associated with this type of spatial theory. Critique is understood primarily as a form of laying bare the devices through which big structural causes of injustice are reproduced, by excluding, by naturalizing, by essentializing. You can see that pattern across different traditions of thought. I'm rushing along, so I'm not going to kind of illustrate them, but that's kind of my broad claim, is that there's a particular structure of thinking across different traditions in which it's primarily thought that the role of geography is to come up with, or geographers and spatial thinkers, is to come up with robust, explanatory, or sometimes ontological accounts of the fundamental causes of wrongs and harms and injuries. And I'm suggesting that that actually reproduces a style of reasoning that is the key problem of the types of normative political philosophy that geographers also don't really like. So, critical analysis in human geography, an urban studies related field, tends, as I said, to focus attention on a range of questions primarily about distributive equity of social and economic outcomes. Geographers have tended, when they talk about social justice, to not really give a great deal of attention to justice as a political concept, right? Justice as a key concept of the modern meaning of democracy. You can see indications, sometimes David Smith in the 1970s, important influential figure in this field, very clearly worked through a series of arguments in which he explicitly started from the proposition that unequal distributions weren't necessarily unjust. Kind of interesting, perhaps counterintuitive thought. David Harvey very famously, actually not ends, but had an argument in The Social Justice in the City, one of the starting points of these sorts of debates, around the challenge of developing understandings of a just distribution justly arrived at. I'm not just thinking about just outcomes, but thinking about justice as a procedure. But those sorts of pathways have never really been fully developed. In fact, geographers have tended, when they do write about justice, to be deeply suspicious of democracy, essentially. You can see that in for example, in Sauge's account of spatial justice. Sauge is deeply suspicious of a thing he calls liberalism, because he thinks it's all about outcomes and not process, which is almost certainly not the case. But what Sauge means when he says that is he's really counterposing philosophers over here thinking about ideal outcomes versus social scientists who can understand processes through which injustice is generated or produced. Of course, the type of process that normative political philosophers are interested in aren't those sorts of processes. It's processes of the fair application of rules. So there's an elision, an interesting elision that you find in Sauge's work. You see that also in, for example, Susan Feinstein's account of The Just City, in which she explicitly contrasts justice, which is about substantive equity of outcomes, and democracy. And she makes that contrast and says essentially justice should trump democracy. There's a sort of suspicion that democracy is always going to be a little bit uncomfortable and too compromising if you're really interested in developing just outcomes. So there's a deep suspicion in these traditions of geography and urban studies and related fields of too much normative theorizing. And that suspicion is expressed in the claim, the assumption that what we do as social scientists, as social analysts, is we can grasp the fundamental causes, the generative dynamics through which inequality and injustice are produced and reproduced. So there's a claim about having access to superior explanatory accounts or ontologies, that those can disclose the meaning of justice. And as I keep repeating, I'll repeat again, interestingly, even though this is an account which works by taking its distance from normative political philosophies of various sorts, there's a very, very similar style of political reasoning going on here. In both accounts, if you like, you have the assumption that the meaning of justice can be arrived at almost purely theoretically in a monological register, either by theorizing about ideals or by theorizing about causes or alternative ontologies. So let me that was the more critical bit. Let me perhaps too quickly give the alternative, or open the alternative avenue that I'm interested in pursuing. What do I mean by the priority of injustice and giving the conceptual priority to injustice in thinking about the geographies of democracy, geographies of politics? As good a place to start as any is a brief argument made by the political philosopher Iris Marion Young more than 20 years ago, but in a geography journal in the middle of a debate in geography around difference and justice and relativism. Young asserts in that intervention that to invoke, I'm quoting now, to invoke the language of justice and injustice is to make a claim. What she's arguing against is to talk about justice is not about, it doesn't imply you're invoking an ideal theory, it's about a process of claims making. It's an assertion. Justice in a deep and fundamental sense, justice talk, is rhetorical. So this is key, I think, to understanding what I mean and what others mean by the priority of injustice. Saying a situation is unjust does not require you necessarily to have a strong model of ideal justice. It doesn't necessarily imply any reference to an ideal theory of what things should be like. Thinking that we must, in advance or implicitly, have a standard of ideal situations prior to being able to say something is unjust might actually get the grammar of justice talk the wrong way round. It tends to reproduce the idea that justice is actually an ideal. Now, from the priority of injustice approach, injustice is understood not as an absence of justice, just as illness is not an absence of health. Injustice is a positive condition. It arises from experiences of injury of some kind, or more broadly, from an abhorrence of wrong. Justice is something not developed to satisfy an ideal standard. Quite the contrary, actually. Justice is not an ideal at all. Justice is an all too human condition that is made manifest through processes of repair, of recognition, of redress, of reparation, of redistribution. So I'm actually summarizing again a more complicated argument about the meaning of this phrase, the conceptual, the priority of injustice. There are a couple of things which are important to stress here about this idea of giving conceptual priority to injustice in analyzing political processes. Firstly, giving conceptual priority to injustice really implies shifting your primary focus away from an idea that the primary issue around justice is to do with the distribution of a primary set of goods or resources or even rights or capabilities. The key theme here, again emerging from particular strands of political theory, is that matters of injustice and justice are primarily to do not with issues of what the people have, but of how are they treated. So giving conceptual priority to injustice involves thinking about how social relations, institutional arrangements, and norms systematically disadvantage some persons as participants in shared practices of public life. i.e., the conceptual priority of injustice is explicitly connected to themes of democracy. Justice and democracy aren't two separate things. You can't think about them separately. So the second theme, moving on from that sense that the key focus is on how people are treated, a political sense of justice, giving conceptual priority of injustice also means focusing on the ways in which issues of justice and injustice always arise through claims making, through demands made in some form of public forum, formally or not. So I'm trying to move towards like a unsatisfactory conclusion around the idea of what does this mean or mean for geography. Now, you may or may not like this argument so far. Another issue with emphasizing claims making, which is a not unusual kind of argument in different strands of social theory and political theory, is that it implies giving a considerable amount of importance to what one might think of as the passionate dynamics through which political action works. But politics isn't supposed to be a rational process of deliberation. It might be all about all sorts of passionate expressions of harm, of injury, of mistreatment. And often those passions, those affects, if you like, might well be negative ones. Anger, resentment, indignation, vengeance might be key mediums, key genres, if you like, through which injustice is articulated. We're back here then to the problem of epistemic justice. There's a potential danger, if you follow the argument so far, the priority of injustice, there is not an ideal that emerges through expressions of harm or injury, that it's often passionate. Well, there's another possible danger is that you end up simply valuing, you kind of give a normative sheen, if you like, to the grievances of those people who have the loudest voice. So that danger specifically requires us to clarify what claims means in this approach. And this then takes us to the final point about significance for geography. Claims making needs to be thought of as having a dual dimension. Claims we can think of as assertions, i.e. claims of injustice are asserted, they're addressed to others. Claims of injury, claims of harm are addressed to others. I do something about it, recognize that injury, perhaps do something to address it or to repair that situation. But they're also assertions in a second sense, that they kind of need to be processed through some sort of deliberative intersubjective context, that simply saying I am being unjustly treated isn't enough, that there's a crucial intersubjective dynamic through which claims of injustice are, if you like, vindicated or warranted. So again, conceptually what that implies, and again I'm sort of racing a little bit, is that injustice is fundamentally a public phenomenon, that the meaning and the experience of injustice emerges and is processed in public realms. Not necessarily ideally, but the point of this type of analysis is to open up a new form of inquiry into the ways in which claims of injustice emerge and are processed or not in particular contexts. So my final point then, as I said, perhaps unsatisfactorily, is what does all this actually have to do with geography? I kind of think this changes not necessarily the content of spatial theories, but the manner in which spatial theories, spatial concepts think of themselves as having a critical vocation, if you like. So let me kind of conclude and summarize with a kind of a pitch, if you like. What makes a state of affairs unjust, I've argued, to those immediately on the receiving end of domination or exploitation or violence, as well as to those called upon to act in response to such states of affairs, is not a reference to a prior construction of what counts as an ideally just world. The conceptual prioritization of injustice rests on a commitment to the idea that harms and violations and wrongs are experienced, felt, expressed, assessed, and vindicated in situations of intersubjective interaction. They're public matters. These are kind of the sort of, if you want, theoretical propositions I've been trying to share with you. Giving conceptual priority to injustice in critical analysis, then, in the sense I've outlined it, requires us to rethink some of the ways in which it's assumed that geographical thought, spatial concepts, spatial theory, thinks of politics and thinks of its critical vocation. As I've said, thinking in terms of claims making, thinking of democracy and justice in terms of claims making does easily at first sight lend itself to the sense that actually surely the key space of politics are various spaces of protest and demonstration, the street, the city, the urban realm, a long, long tradition of that still in geography. I think actually that's fundamentally limiting and flawed in various sorts of ways. the spaces in which injustice, particularly when one recognizes this dual sense of claims making as both an expression of harm, but also then a more, if you like, stretched out process of working through and processing the meaning and significance, assessing those claims of harm, essentially. The spaces in which injustice is apprehended, in which justice is done, are actually stretched out over space and time. They're not spaces of co-presence. They're distributed spaces of recognition, justification, vindication. So thinking about the geographies of injustice in the way in which I've presented it, not just here, but in the book more generally, I think requires a more modest imagination about what spatial concepts could do, perhaps a more pluralist approach to spatial concepts. It requires thinking about the spaces in which harms and wrongs and injuries are generated, but also the spaces through which they become manifest and are challenged, through which claims are made, and also the spaces through which those injustices are redressed or repaired or recognized. There's a complex set of different sorts of spaces and spatialities for which different concepts might be required. Once one stops thinking of claims of injustice narrowly as only expressions of a demand, claims making is opened up to a whole set of processes through which claims are made, but also through which claims of injustice are responded to, are processed, through which practices might be adjusted, through which those claims were acted upon, through which certain arrangements are transformed and legitimized. So from the perspective I've been discussing here, justice is, to reiterate, something that is done. Therefore, far from thinking of fields of governance, policy implementation, decision-making, of examples of kind of post-democratic police administration, as they might be presented by a very dominant trend of political thought in geography and spatial disciplines at the moment, we might well just be better advised to think of myriad practices of administration, government, management of, if you like, rule and of ruling over people. All of those practices are always structured by and processing claims and counterclaims, and are where dynamics of democratization and perhaps de-democratization are worked through. That implies lots of the spatial concepts that actually Kevin might touch upon about the state and the territory. For example, state and territory, perhaps borders, might actually have much, much more ambivalent, potentially positive roles to play in the politics of justice than is often thought or allowed in critical traditions. So let me kind of quickly summarize. Again, I recognize I'm kind of racing through. The kind of focus on claims making invoked in giving not only practical but conceptual priority to injustice requires, I would argue, an acknowledgement of a whole range of different spatialities which move beyond kind of this romanticized image of the spaces of protest and spaces of demonstration in the street, the forum, the city. If one really wants to think about the spaces and geographies of injustice, then one might think of a whole series of combinations of perhaps those spaces, but also certain spaces of privacy and secrecy, and also spaces of legislation, spaces of administration and rule in various sorts of ways. The argument in favor then of according injustice conceptual primacy over ideals of justice requires us giving up the idea that you can kind of come up with a monological determination of the meaning of justice, either by reference to certain sort of political philosophy or by reference to cast iron explanatory theories or alternative ontologies. Where this leads us, or where it takes us back, perhaps, and this would be my final point, is it really requires us to take up anew the challenge of thinking democratically about justice, of theorizing democratically about justice. That's a challenge which David Harvey, as I said, might well have laid down in the middle of social justice in the city in 1973, when he presented this challenge of thinking about how to develop a just distribution justly arrived at. It's the second aspect of Harvey's formulation, which was never really developed, not by Harvey, and broadly speaking, not by the tradition of radical and critical scholarship in geography that's followed. There remains then an unfulfilled potential for working through this dual aspect of thinking about justice as a set of just outcomes, justly arrived at and justly processed. That's where the potential, I think, arises from thinking about and focusing upon this theme of the conceptual priority of injustice in the analysis of the politics of, the geographies of politics. I'll kind of stop there. I realize I might well have been ranting, and I've rushed over all sorts of difficult, complex issues, but that I will end at that point.
Thanks, Professor Barnett. It was a very interesting lecture. We definitely have questions at the end for you, definitely. But now I invite our next guest, Professor Kevin Cox, for our virtual table. So I'm saying thank you again. We are, as our second invited professor, we are honored having here Professor Kevin Cox. Kevin Cox is an emeritus faculty at Geography Department of Ohio State University, and he is author of a lot of important books and papers in political geography and geographic thought. He's a political geography with strong interests in the politics of local and regional development, the city, the history of geographic thought, and South Africa. He's pursuing these topics using a Marxist framework of understanding. His latest article you can see at his website. Here's the name, you can see it below. Besides that, in his website, you can also see his latest blog posts. The latest book is called The Politics of Urban and Regional Development and the American Exception, published at 2016. So thanks again. It's an honor having you here. So you have also around 30-40 minutes to your lecture. And I just have to say thank you again, Professor Cox. And now it's with you.
Okay, well, thank you for, well, Ina, I suppose. Ina invited me, but thank you for your very kind introduction. I would say at the beginning that I think this sort of exercise is a very useful one, by which I mean speaking across linguistic divides. So I have this thing that although we're geographers, we don't show much interest in countries. So I suspect the Brazilians, I don't know, but I suspect the Brazilian geographers don't show much interest outside, in particular countries outside Brazil. Of course, they're aware of them, but they don't bring them into any sort of focus with respect to Brazil. I've been very lucky myself, because for my first 20 years, I grew up in England, then I went to the United States. That was a major culture shock. And ever since then, I've been asking, why is the United States so peculiar? And asking that question has enabled me to understand England. Likewise, I became interested in South Africa. So I relish this sort of occasion where one can speak across a linguistic divide. And perhaps what I'm going to say might put your own frameworks in some sort of question. I'm not saying that my framework is a particularly Anglophone one, however, but it is not an orthodox framework. So the title of my talk is Keywords in a Political Geography for Capitalism. I emphasize capitalism. That's absolutely crucial to what I'm going to say. So by way of introduction, with respect to keywords, there was a person, a literary, well, he was an English professor at Cambridge. His name was Raymond Williams. And he wrote a very interesting book called Keywords. And what he does in Keywords is take perhaps 50 commonly used words, and he explores how their meanings have changed over time. So for example, he certainly talks about class. I do believe he talks about the countryside. Actually, I'm not sure about that. He talks about country. He talks about freedom. And he approaches these from an historical standpoint, looking at the way in which they've developed, paying some attention, not as much as I would have liked, to the social circumstances which led to changes in their meaning. This idea of key words was picked up by David Harvey. David Harvey wrote an article. It was in a festschrift written in his honor. He wrote an article called Space as a Key Word. Now, the way David approaches the question is not historical in the way that Raymond Williams did. Rather, he looks at the different meanings of space that we draw upon in capitalist societies, how they complement each other, how we use them in certain circumstances, and so on and so forth. So I'm taking my cue from David and looking at what I think are some key words in contemporary contemporary political geography. This actually, it doesn't matter whether I'm a Marxist or not. I still think they're key words. Now, in the written version of the paper, I specified 4 of them. I said territory, the state, country, geopolitics. I'm actually going to leave out country. I'm not really sure about it. I'm not really sure about it from the standpoint of the framework I'm going to draw on. Also, of course, we don't have much time. So territory, the state, and geopolitics, in that order, specifically in that order. I'm taking them in what I believe, I'm taking them in an order which I believe goes from higher levels of abstraction to lower levels. In other words, you cannot understand the state unless you understand territory. You cannot understand geopolitics unless you understand both the state and territory. So territory, the state, geopolitics, and then some concluding remarks. So if you go to the Dictionary of Human Geography and look up territory, as I did, John Agnew has an entry, and he defines territory. He talks about it being, he talks about it as emphasizing a contiguous space organized by a group or a person to control access. Right now, this is a very general definition. I think it's flawed. I don't think it fits the capitalist case particularly well. But the important point I want to get over here is that John was trying to provide a general definition, regardless of social circumstance. You have to take into account the social conditions of the time. Look, territory is different under feudalism than it is under capitalism. Under feudalism, territory meant rent. In capitalism, it's about production. It's about controlling production in a certain space, controlling access to that space, but also using that space, what I would call a space of accumulation, as a springboard, as a home base for launching competitive attacks, if you like, in other parts of the world. So, first point, we should be skeptical of general definitions of territory. We need something specific to capitalism. So let me tell you what I think territory amounts to in this day and age. I would locate territory in an interaction. It's an interaction between the way in which production gets localized and the way in which it gets delocalized. The delocalization is a threat to localization. That's where you begin to get a sense of territory emerging, a sense of wanting to keep out or wanting to attract in new investment, for example. So, to talk about localization first, I want to emphasize something called the socialization of production. Now, capitalism is unique in the degree to which it socializes production. And it all begins with the socialization of the elements that go into the labor process. It begins with the creation of markets in labor and markets in means of production. This is what Marx, of course, referred to as primitive accumulation, the historical separation of immediate producers from the means of production. Localization is obviously a more concrete concept. The process of socialization depends upon the presence of those labor markets and markets and means of production, those things that are available for everybody, as long as they have the money to access them, right? It's a common resource, as long as you have money. More concretely, the socialization of production is really a socio-spatialization. It occurs within a limited space, a space that is limited by the cost and time that it takes to transport goods. It's defined by the emergence of a division of labor, shared labor, in other words, right? A division of labor. Different factories producing different things, the country and the city, agriculture and industry. So the division of labor. Secondly, common shared means of production. I'm not just thinking of assembly lines, important as they are. I'm thinking of all those things that capitalists share, like the airport, the railroad network, the waterworks, the power plant, and so on and so forth. Many of which, of course, are provided by the state. So the state plays a role in the socialization of production, but it comes in to fill in the gaps, as we'll see. Why socialization? Well, capitalism is about appropriating surplus labor. The socialization of production, that is what it's about. It's about the appropriation of surplus labor. It's about speeding up the circulation of capital. That introduces tensions into the workplace, of course. People are being exploited. They don't know it exactly, but what they do know is that they're being subject to unemployment. They're being subject to overtime without extra payment and so on and so forth. They know that. So there are class tensions at the center of this process that have to be managed. So you have to have some sort of understanding in order for production to proceed. All this is, and this is major, all this is extremely fixing in space. It fixes things, all right? You've got all this plant, you've got the railroads, you've got an agreement with labor that can't be moved around. It's highly concrete. It reflects the concrete circumstances of a place and a time. You've got a tissue of social relations between firms, between workers. You know, think about the recruitment of workers by corporations. That depends hugely, believe it or not, on word of mouth. Workers telling each other, hey, there's a job, such and such. So you've got this fixity in a space of accumulation. And this, of course, is going to make things very interesting, very vulnerable for both workers and capitalists. So you have this moment of delocalization as well, in which spaces of delocalization as a result of things like the cheapening of transport. In fact, the cheapening of transport is absolutely fundamental. So you get the emergence of new spaces of accumulation at larger geographic scales. Think about it. There's a hierarchy of these. Think of the words we use. We talk about local economies, regional economies, national economies, a global economy. So there's a hierarchy of these spaces of accumulation that have emerged over time. Now, at each stage in that process, obviously I'm abstracting a great deal here. At each stage in that process, there's the potential for values in place to be undermined. You have a national space of accumulation. As it emerges, some localities will benefit. They're producing the right sorts of things. They can develop their position in the national division of labor, the national spatial division of labor. Other places are going to be challenged. Right? They're going to be confronted with debts that they can't pay, debts on buildings, housing for workers that haven't been paid off. They're going to all be confronted by assets that are deteriorating in value, that are losing their value from the standpoint of collateral for loans. They're going to be confronted with the possibility of bankruptcy, joblessness, and so on and so forth. So what you get in these circumstances is the emergence of some sort of coalition of forces, often cross-class, often involving capital and labor, coming together around agendas to restructure the local economy, or in fact, the regional economy, to, in the famous words of D. Trump, make America great again. Think about what that was. It was actually a coalition of coalitions. It was a coalition of coalitions in many coal belt cities, which have lost employment, many small towns throughout the US South and the Great Plains, which have lost their branch plants. Where have they gone? They've gone to China, right? We're talking about a global space of accumulation being a challenge to not just the national space of accumulation, which is the United States, but particular locations in that national space. So you then get claims on the state to do something about it, which is where MAGA comes in, right? Make America Great Again. If Trump had proceeded, if he hadn't been so distracted, right? The person was a model of distraction, obviously. I mean, as well as lots of other things. Then there would surely have emerged conflicts around what that program meant. Some localities are going to lose out. So you're going to have a lot of contestation of what a territorial sort, protecting local economies. But also, when I talk about territory in this sense, it's not just about protecting, it's not just about excluding, it's also including. It's about bringing the branch plants back, which is what Trump was about, among other things, when he was in his more sane moments. So, territory, the state is obviously playing into this, right? In these regions, localities seeking redress. So let me talk about the state. The state is a highly territorial object, right? Obviously, it has boundaries. It does indeed, as John Agnew says, control those boundaries. It controls movements in, also controls, it not only keeps things out, as John suggested, it also attracts things in, right? So I'm sure the United States would like to see a lot of inward investment, right? As would any city in the United States. They all compete for that inward investment. And the state is very important in that. But the state is, you've got a country. The state is the ruling institution. Within that country, you're going to have lots of smaller scale spaces of accumulation that are contesting with each other, as indeed they would have done over MAGA. You would have contests between Silicon Valley and the Great Lakes region, for example, if the MAGA program had been implemented in any halfway obvious manner. So you have these territorial conflicts between places within the United States, or within Brazil, or within the United Kingdom. Now think of the state. The structure of the state reflects those territorial tensions. The state is organized territorially. Think about elections. We elect people to represent our locality. Think about the outputs of the state. A lot of the state's outputs are highly targeted geographically. They're targeted to particular places. Urban renewal is an obvious one. Agricultural subsidies are another. Some of them are not so obvious. Something like taxation has a varying incidence on people because incomes vary over space. So there are explicit geographical targeting policies, more implicit ones. Then think about how the way the state itself is organized, right? Its own division of labor. It has a scalar division of labor. It has a central government. It has local governments. Perhaps it has regional governments. All these are there to express some sort of local concern. A local concern, incidentally, which may be shared with other localities. So even though the Labour Party in Britain was a national party, it nevertheless it brought together extremely localized concerns. It brought together concerns about housing. It brought together concerns about health. So although we talk about national political parties, we shouldn't be misled into thinking that they are truly national, that people don't care about where they live. Of course they care about where they live. So the state itself, though, to return to that theme, the scalar division of labor, then you have certain departments which are obviously geographically targeted. The Department of Agriculture, every state has a Department of Agriculture. The Department of Housing, which is typically concerned with the city, and so on and so forth. So the state is a highly territorial thing. It is, however, highly variable, right? So the United States is very different as a state from the British state, which is something we could talk about and elaborate on. Let me talk now, finally, about geopolitics. So the territory presupposes the state presupposes territory. Geopolitics presupposes the state and territory. It is, at a very fundamental level, about territory. It's about the global political economy, where the investment is taking place. It's about uneven development. It's about protecting what you have in a particular place, or using a particular place as a springboard to get more. The vehicle for expressing these demands on the world stage is, of course, the state. Note, however, when I talk about geopolitics, I'm not thinking just of the state on a world stage. We can think about geopolitics in the way I'm going to discuss it, in the way that's already implicit in what I've said. We can think about geopolitics within a particular national space. So there's been a struggle in Great Britain, United Kingdom, for regional ascendancy. For some while now, it has been decided that the region that really matters is London and the Southeast. This actually relates also, think about this hierarchy of spaces. It relates to the United Kingdom's position in the global economy. So London and the Southeast are being favored by the government. The national government has responded to demands from London and the Southeast because of the government's view that London and the Southeast are critical to Britain's balance of payments to its export drive. So you can have a geopolitics within the country, you can have a geopolitics at the metropolitan level. Very easy in the United States, because in the United States, every metropolitan area is divided into lots of local governments. Typically, it's the central city that has the upper hand, but not necessarily. In a place like Detroit, where the central city has been, the political city, I mean, the municipality of Detroit, where it's been significantly emptied out, it's no longer the case that it dominates the metropolitan area in the way that in my metropolitan area, Columbus does. Columbus is a growing city. So my point here is that we can apply what I'm saying, not just to the typical site of geopolitics, which is the international. We can also look at it nationally. We can also look at it at a metropolitan level. Now, the person who has written most persuasively on geopolitics is David Harvey, who wrote a paper called The Geopolitics of Capitalism. He picks up on a lot of the arguments that I've already made. In fact, I originally got them from David, and I've tried to develop them. So David puts at the center this whole relationship between fixity and mobility, and how governments try to protect national accumulation spaces. Historically, they did it in part through empire. Empire provided them with a market area, a source of raw materials that they could monopolize. More recently, it's worked through global institutions. So we have a set of, we don't have a global government, which is a shame in this day and age, global warming. We don't have a global government, but we do have some global institutions that are a quasi-global government. We have the International Monetary Fund. We have the World Bank. We have a world money, which is the dollar. Right? Every country in the world wants to hold dollars because the United States is such a large economy. Everywhere imports from the United States. I doubt there's, well, perhaps there are countries like North Korea that don't, but most countries do. So you have a world money. And money is, that's an instrument of the state. So the United States enjoys a hegemony in the global economy. It's structured the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to its advantage. Voting rights depend on how much money you subscribe. The United States subscribes the most. It has used that power to impose its vision of capitalism on other countries. It's done that in order to clear the way for American corporations. So in the crisis of 1997 in East Asia, the big bugaboo, the big complaint from American corporations was what was called crony capitalism, which from their standpoint meant keeping American corporations out. Right? There was a recession in East Asia. The US Treasury, along with the International Monetary Fund, Wall Street pressure groups, imposed a regime on those countries in which they had to admit, in exchange for loans from the International Monetary Fund, they had to admit American corporations. Very interesting, the way in which it's done. Now, I think there's a serious problem with David Harvey's thing, and this is where I want to conclude. Well, this is my final substantive point before I wrap things up. It's very much about competition between countries. Now, I'm sure David would respond and say, well, of course, we can't understand that competition except in terms of the class relationship. And I think that's absolutely true. So there's a sense in which what he has is a geopolitics of class, but it's not very explicit. What I'm going to say is that there's a big untold story in geopolitics. There's a big untold story that spans what I will call the short 20th century, from about 1920, actually a little 1920 to 1990. So immediately you can probably see what I'm getting at. Okay, so look, first of all, 1917, the Russian Revolution, followed in quick succession by attempted revolutions in Germany and Hungary, then by a serious outbreak of labor militancy, including the general strike in Britain in 1926. Look, ruling classes around the world were scared. They were really, really worried. This is the context for what some have called Europe's Civil War. The war was between the labor movement in its various national manifestations and capitalist ruling classes. It was initially evident in the Spanish Civil War. So what happened in the Spanish Civil War? Did the British or the French or the Americans give any help to the Republicans? Of course not. They wanted Franco to win, right? They wanted Franco to suppress these nasty leftists, right? So that's when the curtain goes up on Europe's Civil War. It persists into the Second World War, first of all, in the form of Germany against Russia. Look, the United States and Britain were very happy to see Germany invade Russia. They were very happy to see Germany try to dislodge the communist government. What worried them, of course, was that Germany was going to be a competitor for them. America in particular. America was worried about not just Germany, but also Japan, and what that meant for American hegemony in the future. So you had the Second World War. You had the resistance movements, which were communist-led, right? So the resistance movement in Europe against the German fascists, right? You've got this sort of class element coming in very strongly. This is then concluded by the Civil War in Greece, where again, the communists are defeated. That's Europe's Civil War. Then you have the Cold War. Again, think about it. What was going on in the Cold War? The United States intervened around the world. It intervened to prop up, to support ruling class regimes, capitalist regimes. It intervened throughout Central America in order to prevent those regimes toppling. It actually failed in Nicaragua, but it tried and tried and tried. There was something called Reagan Gate, which you might have heard of. So the Cold War was a second phase of this attempt to squelch the labor movement on a global scale, to put it in its place. And of course, it's now been put in its place. Right? The global capitalist class, or national capitalist classes in coalition with one another, they've succeeded. Right? So, and this, of course, is one of the problems. This is one of the problems that capitalism is confronting. There's no pressure from underneath. Right? There's no pressure towards innovation, towards developing the productive forces, and so on and so forth. So, a different sort of geopolitics. Now, let me just, in conclusion, let me just reflect back on political geography. This talk was about key words in political geography. So I've emphasized these three things: territory, state, geopolitics. I doubt there are many political geographers who would disagree with that. They'd say, yes, that's perfectly correct. But where it can lead can vary, right? So historically, political geography has been a very conservative discipline. It would take those terms in very reified forms, it would tear them out of context, much as John Agnew did with respect to territory. And otherwise, I admire John, but in that particular instance, he tears the idea of territory out of any conceivable social context. Right? You have to put these terms in their social context. You have to put them to work, make them work. And that's what I've tried to do. That's what I've tried to start rectifying. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cox. It was so many things to think about it, actually. So I would like to thank you both for your both lectures. So many things to think and debate. So nice, and at the same moment, so different perspectives, I think, about the relation between politics and geography. We have questions from the public, but I want to ask two things to try to clarify things first before going to the public. The first question I would like to make is for Professor Barnett about the problem of justice and injustice. From a normative perspective, seems that can be confused with a moral problem, I think. In critical geography, do you think the influence of Marxist thought with things capitalism more as a moral problem have facilitated the confusion between justice and equality in critical special theory? In which sense, if you agree with that, in which sense do you think so? And Professor Cox, I was reading your text and listening to your presentation, and you chose 4 key words for political geography of capitalism: territory, state, country, and geopolitics. Why not politics? Why not politics is a key word for political geography of capitalism? Where is politics?
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, sure.
Why geopolitics?
Why you didn't choose politics as a key word for political geography of capitalism? Where is politics in political geography of capitalism? Because when you chose territory, state, country, and geopolitics, I was thinking of myself, and the word politics, is the word politics important, a key word for this subject? So after that, I'm going to get some questions from the public. And yeah, thanks again. So I maybe Professor Barnett, you can answer first. I can hear you. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, that's a big question. Let me kind of. I suppose one of the things you may I mean, Kevin's in a sense kind of articulated, some of the key contributions that sort of a tradition of Marxist geography makes. What in relation to kind of your question of kind of how geographers have dealt with issues of justice and so on, it strikes me, I've thought this a long time, that geography's Marxism is quite odd in a way. That because it's kind of quite homegrown, and it has been for a long time. Harvey has this, I think, relatively well-known line about learning Marx by reading Capital, not by reading Capital, which is a reference to Althusser. So I think that's interesting, precisely because I think, as it were, mainstream academic Marxism, certainly in Europe and North America, is probably much more suspicious of normative things than geography's Marxism has, because to a large extent, Marxism in geography and social justice, it's not that they map exactly onto each other, because there's other strands of thought that have done the justice thing too. But they were synonyms in Harvey's own work. So I think the question of like it being a moral issue is an interesting one. I think kind of geography's Marxism might be much more moralistic than Marxism, not necessarily, I mean, in a bad sense, than other traditions of Marxism. So I mean, that would be, that's kind of the hunch I have, that in a certain sense, if you wanted to find a tradition of Marxism that had thought seriously about issues of justice, even if I've kind of developed a certain sort of critique of them, then you'd go to geography. You wouldn't, I think, go and find that in other traditions of Marxist thought, in sociology or other strands of Marxism. Where that would be my hypothesis.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay. So, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Why didn't I include politics? Well, I actually did, didn't I, when I talked about the state and geopolitics? But I think, well, number one, I was trying to find words that incorporated some spatial sense. Now, you can come back at me at that and say, well, the state doesn't. Well, you can't have a state unless it occupies space. That's what I would say. So I think all those three key words incorporate space quite explicitly in the case of territory and geopolitics, more implicitly in the case of state. But I think there's something else here, that when you say politics, I don't know. Well, many people, when they say politics, they're thinking of formal politics. They're thinking of politicians. They're thinking of pressure groups and political parties. But for a Marxist, everything's political. You don't need the state to exercise power. The corporations, excuse me, let me start again. Hiring, the people who do hiring for corporations, they draw on the corporation's power every day when they say to somebody, sorry, but we no longer need you. So I think power is everywhere. And it's not, so perhaps I would say politics with a small p, right, is what we should attend to, in addition to, not excluding politics with a large p. Politics with a large p, more formal. But so no, first of all, politics didn't strike me as being particularly spatial in its meaning. And secondly, I would say that if we want to think about politics, we should think about it very broadly, and not just in terms of the institutions of government.
Okay, thank you both for your answering. I will have a few questions in the public, and we have two questions from the Professor Ina, from Professor Cox, actually. So I want to show you the question number one. Let me see if I can show you. Just a minute. Yes, I think so. It's here. Yeah. Just a minute, I'm having a little problem here. So the idea of it's from Professor Cox, but of course, Professor Barnett, if you want to comment too, it'd be very, very nice. So the idea of, I want to write here.
Oh, here we go.
Can you see here? Yeah.
Yeah.
The idea of analysis centered on capitalism seems to be contained in tautology. After all, everything that exists, particular or general, is caused by the system that is global. In this sense, does the explanation of any phenomenon bring with it a previously established answer? So this is a question from Professor Ina. It's directly from Professor Cox, but of course can be answered to Professor Barnett.
Can I see the rest of the question? Can you go back to the first part? Okay, so the global, yeah, sure, everything's connected in a. Well, no, I'm going to challenge that actually. I mean, obviously, physically, Ina is correct. When we think of physical geography, I think it's perfectly legitimate. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
When we think of political geography, I think it's excuse me. When we think of physical geography, I think it's perfectly legitimate to start with the world, to start with the globe, to start with the the fact that the Earth rotates on an axis, that winds move from west to east, that the excuse me, tectonic, the theory of plates, tectonic plates, right? That's a global thing. I think when we start talking about the social, though, I think that's more difficult because historically, look, it's only since about 1500, the year 1500, that one could actually claim that. I'm not even sure as early as that one could claim that one had a global system or a world system, as Wallerstein would have called it. There's an interesting quote somewhere towards the beginning of Halford Mackinder's Democratic Ideals and Reality, where he talks about how everywhere has now been discovered. He's writing in 1919. How everywhere has been discovered. We now, henceforth, we live in a closed system, he says. We can no longer expand anywhere. We can no longer expand dominion, by which he means, of course, the British dominion or the dominions of the empires, and how things are going to reverberate from one point of the world to another, how we are all connected. So I think the actual connection at a social level is an historical achievement. It hasn't always been there. And this was something that Marx wrote about in the Communist Manifesto. He wrote about it in the Grundrisse too. So I don't think it's tautological at all. I think that you cannot take the world as a unity for granted. It's something that's actually being created, and capitalism has played a primary role in that creation.
Thank you. I don't know if Professor Barnett wants to comment something about this question.
I mean, the one thing I just thought, I mean, in a sense, this reflects back on sort of the deeper, not the deeper, the background of what I was talking to in relation to that kind of in relation to the kind of the style of political philosophy I was kind of not talking about but invoking. One of the interesting things about a lot of that recent work in the last 2 decades is that it does have a very kind of simplistic image of the global. It's assumed that everything has become globalized, everything's connected. And then some of those arguments then become quite interesting about global democracy and so on. But so actually, in some sense, doesn't have a very geographical sense of the global, which I do again. I think is an interesting aspect of a geographical imagination, that you can think globally, but the point of conveying is what you're actually thinking about is all the differences, and why an audience of Brazilian geographers can't quite catch up with my colloquial English. So I think that I would take the question as raising kind of really interesting questions about what we think the global really signifies. It actually signifies an even deeper, more complicated sense of differentiation than things immediately concatenating and all being the same.
Okay, thank you. Now I can we have so many questions from the public, so I have to summarize them, I think, otherwise we're going to stay here for forever. I think we have a kind of few questions that similar to Professor Barnett. Can I do 2 questions in a row? Is that okay? Okay. I will translate this one to English, but I'm going to show here. She asks if you, when you said that you cannot separate the idea of justice and democracy, she's asking what kind of democracy? The representative democracy or another one? So what kind of democracy you are talking about? At the same place, just a minute. This one is in English, so I won't have problem to translate. So say, I would also want to ask whether he believes or not if the normative-based problems of representative democracy hamper an approach that focuses on justice as a political concept. If so, how could we overcome them? So it's kind of similar, I think, the questions, but it's I think can I do one more, like similar one, like 3 in the okay. So this, I think it's for both. I think no, it is for both. What is the limits of democracy in capitalist world? What are the limits of democracy in capitalist world? So I think first, Professor Barnett, can you answer?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I suppose I'd be classic academic answer as well. It's more complicated than that. Or let me shift the terms of the question. I suppose. I mean, I'm actually quite fond of the idea of representative democracy. So I think things like elections and so on are much weirder than is often given. They're often given credit for. Again, not least in that sort of those various strands of political philosophy, which last 20 or 30 years often start by saying, well, we know what liberal representative democracy is, and it's rather static and unsexy. We need alternative versions. Well, actually, Marx, has wonderful accounts of British elections and just how bizarre and peculiar they are, and how they reveal the fragility of power. So I mean, I don't have a preference for one version or not. I think the question of the relationship between notions of justice and democracy and that injustice perspective raises. It does 2 things. One of the things is it does challenge the adequacy, if you like, of the constantly searching for more radical conceptions of democracy, which tend to be deeply suspicious of institutionalization. If you revolve around that sense that at some level justice is something that has to be done to correct, to redress, to repair, then that kind of requires you to think not necessarily of elections and representative democracy, but it does require you to reassess the value for justice being done of certain sorts of institutional arrangements, and then it in turn requires you, of course, to think about how those can be made accountable, transparent, and so on. And more generally, I think, I like the concept of representation. I think representation, not representative democracy, is irreducible from a not least for geographical reasons. Once one thinks that politics is stretched out across the kind of spaces that Kevin's talked about, for example, then democracy can't not be representative in the broadest sense. It involves delegations and speaking fors, and whether or not what form that takes. So I think that relationship between democracy and justice might actually hinge on notions of representation. The kind of issue of what's the limit of democracy in the capitalist world? So I will invert that one. I think it might be a more entertaining discussion to think about how contemporary capitalism, in particular, has been structured by and in interesting ways steered by the single most significant political shift in the last 20 or 30 years is generalized formal democracy around the whole world, and that, of course, which we all then don't like and isn't adequate. But that's a really fundamental shift in the way in which territories and states and so on have been ordered, and that raises really interesting questions about how capitalism does and doesn't operate. I think again, that's my smart way of answering the question.
Okay.
So two parts to my answer. The first, and that they don't have much relationship. Well, I don't think they have much relationship to one another. So during the last presidential election, one of the things that I read, and I thought, well, this is absolutely true. It's not just the American electorate that has a stake, a concern for the outcome of the election. It's people in lots of other places in the world. So why don't they have a vote in the presidential election? So there's something about the geography of democracy that I think is quite interesting. That's slightly superficial remark because I can't enlarge on it at the present moment. But I think it is something worth thinking about. The question was, what is the limit of democracy in a capitalist world? I would prefer to reframe that question and say, why is democracy in a capitalist world so limited? And I don't mean to say that, you don't have formal democracy in some countries, or it's imperfect or whatever. What I mean by that is the way in which capitalism has so brilliantly adapted to the fact of formal democratic institutions. And it's very interesting when you look back, because in the 19th century, there was massive opposition from business circles to extending the franchise to the population as a whole. That is the reason that extension of the franchise went in stages. Or it's one that, yeah, it's the immediate reason why it went in stages. So it was first of all granted to people with a certain amount of property. Then it was granted to people with slightly less property. And then in the end, they said, well, to hell with it. We'll give it to everybody, except women, of course, right? Women didn't get the vote till 1918 in Britain. But by then you had an all-male franchise. So what happened? There's a Swedish sociologist called Terborn who wrote about this. And he said that one of the reasons capitalism was able to survive in a democratic world, obviously the concern that capitalists had about the extension of the franchise was that the masses would tax them to death, right? They would tax the wealthy, right? But it didn't work out that way. What happened was that, sure, there was progressive taxation, but capital has, and I think I'm using the word that Terborn uses, he says it has a technical elasticity. In other words, if its profits are threatened, it can improve the productivity of its workers and make sure that its profits are not threatened, right? So it can well afford to pay higher taxes. Higher taxes are not necessarily contradictory to maintaining profit rates. So that was Terborn in trying to understand how the universal franchise came about. Once it came about, and one of my references here is somebody called Adam Jaworski, who's a Polish sociologist or maybe political scientist at the University of Chicago. He had a quite important article in the New Left Review on social democracy as a historical phenomenon. I think that was the title of the article. You can find it. Or if you want to know where it is, just contact me. And what he showed was that by taking the parliamentary route, All right. So the labor movement was important in bringing about the universal franchise. You then had parties representative of the labor movement. So you had the Labour Party in Britain, you had the Socialists in France, you had the Social Democrats in Germany. Look what happened to them. Jaworski thinks the mistake that was made was to go what he calls the parliamentary route. In other words, these parties wanted to be elected. Right? Once they contested elections, then they had to broaden their program to include not just the militants of the labor movement, but people who were more indifferent. In order to get a majority, according to Jaworski, in order to get a majority, labor parties had to reach beyond the working classes. I think he's wrong in his assumption about what the working class consists of. He should have expressed it more in terms of the way the working class is differentiated. It's not just coal miners, it's not just railway workers, the steel industry, which was the historic base of the labor movement in Britain. But I think he has a point that once in office, they had to dilute their program in order to get elected. So socialism turned out to be a disappointment once Labour parties were in power. There are other reasons too. Labour parties, how can I put this? There's a whole vocabulary in parliamentary democracy. There's a whole set of understandings that working class people have trouble with. So the Labour Party has gotten colonized by, lawyers. It's mainly lawyers, some school teachers, people who have the ability to articulate an argument. Most working class people are embarrassed. They're embarrassed to go before a city council because they don't have the right way to express it. So democracy has been pretty much a disappointment for the Labour movement.
Thank you for answering. I think we are bothering you already enough. It's 1 hour and 40 minutes of meeting, but I have 2 more questions if you allow me to do it. And then we finally finish this very interesting meeting we had today with 2 great professors. So we have one is, I think it's more for Professor Cox, but both subjects are so similar that you can both answer. This is there a territory today for capital without borders?
So, brilliant. I like it.
Yeah. And the last one, I think, can I do the one more and it's 2 together? Yeah.
Yep.
So this one, to what extent different types of notion of politics and democracy nowadays interfere in the reflection by the field of political geography on the extended position of conflicts in the social and political context? I think this is more to Professor Barnett, but of course, again, both can answer. So I'm showing again the question so you can read it and be sure what is. Can you start this time, Professor Cox?
Sorry?
Can you start the answering now?
So can you give me that first question again?
Okay.
Okay. I like it. I like it a lot. It's brilliant. The short answer is yes. Yes. Yeah, that, I mean, it's true. We live in a world of multinational corporations. Though it's very interesting. You look at the board of directors of a transnational corporation. So you have Embraer in Brazil, which is a multinational corporation. I would hazard a guess that Embraer has almost entirely Brazilian directors. the support of the Brazilian government is very important to Embraer. The support of a respective government is very important to any national corporation. So to take an example that I gave earlier, in the late 90s, when there was a recession in East Asia, American transnational corporations used the federal government. They used the federal government to break down those barriers. They used, the federal government had some say in the policies of the International Monetary Fund. I talk about this in my paper, actually. So is there, are we moving to an unterritorial world? No, I don't think we are. I think one of the reasons for that, I think it's very interesting. I haven't thought about this question in some while. I think one of the reasons for that is that a transnational corporation, look, it's not strictly deterritorialized. It always has to put its feet down somewhere. It has to be concerned about conditions in the countries where it operates. And it needs the backing, the support of a home country in order to resolve those difficulties.
Thank you, Professor Barnett. Do you want to comment something about this question, or just the next one?
I was sort of just been kind of scribbling some thoughts down on the next question. Maybe I might connect back to something that Kevin said earlier. I should sort of admit that I actually don't think of myself as a political geographer. I don't really have a background in political geography, but I was also thinking before this event. I think the status of subdisciplines in geography, certainly in my experience, is quite an interesting one. I remember about a decade ago being invited to an event all about kind of political agency, and which was trailed as a kind of an interdisciplinary workshop. And all the other people there worked in politics departments from across Europe. But what was clear was that some of them thought of themselves as political scientists. Some of them thought of themselves as IR scholars. There was a political theorist or two. And then there were people who were area studies people, and they clearly inhabited entirely different worlds. And then there was me. I was the only person who wasn't from politics. And the people I got on best with were the area studies people who knew people who might have come in geography. And that I remember realizing then that in geography, subdisciplines aren't identities. Certainly maybe in Anglo-American geography, they're not really like identities. I tend to think of them as a bit like rooms of a building that you can be in the political geography room in the morning, and then in the afternoon you can wander into the urban studies room, and it would be quite a lot of the same people talking about the same sort of thing, but perhaps with a different inflection. And then in the evening you might wander into the cultural geography room where there'd be clubbing and stuff like that, but they'd still be talking about politics, right? So my serious point is that then I think political geography I've always not identified very strongly with it, because I don't actually think it predominantly has a sense of politics in the way in which I've been most interested in it. I think it does tend to have a sense of politics as the exercise of power in various sort of top-down kind of ways, which isn't quite necessarily the same sense of politics you might get in work interested more in urban politics. So a more sense of struggle and interests and compromises and deal making. It doesn't have to be a lovely sense of democratic power, but how is control actually exercised in the to and fro of things? So I think the point Kevin made about, there's politics as a formal electoral thing, and then there's a whole set of other kind of deeper structural things which are also political. That's one issue. But I also think there's a whole series of, as it were, not just structural exercise of power, but all sorts of realms in which ordinary, everyday deal-making, compromising goes on. So actually, I think there are two ways of going out from beyond a sort of a highly formal. Yeah. And I think I tend to think if you're interested in that version of politics, you'd wander into the urban studies room or into the cultural studies room, because I suspect political geography still tends to be hung up with, Kevin is somebody who can talk in both of those fields because he can do the territory thing, which he did today. But he can also do how are interests and coalitions drawn together, in urban space, and that's not a political geography imagination, I think, actually.
Okay, can I respond to that? Really, this is not contradicting Clive, but it's trying to explain. I think he's right about the rooms and how one can go from one room to the next. And I think that has to do, I don't think that would have been true before the, should we say, the mid-70s. I think that from the early 70s on, as part of the critique of the spatial quantitative work, geographers discovered power. Human geographers discovered power. So you have this thing in the Anglophone geography called critical human geography. Critical human geography, it's all about power. It's not the way I would talk about power, but it permeates their discussions. And critical human geography, as Clive didn't make this connection, but the urban geographers there, the cultural geographers, the economic geographers, not so many economic geographers, interestingly. The political geographers, they can talk. They can talk through this language of power. They can interact. I think the critical human geography now has, in Anglophone geography, it has a dominant position. If you take a look at the Blackwell Dictionary of Human Geography, the dictionary, it's just critical human geography. It's depressing, actually. I think it's depressing because they do not pay sufficient respect to the history of the discipline. They don't pay sufficient respect to the work that the spatial quantitative geographers did. They're not interested. They've rejected it, which is a great pity, because you can look at that stuff in a new frame. You can look at it in a new light. Doreen Massey's, yabbered on about juxtapositions. Very interesting, very interesting. And believe me, I learned a lot from her. But you can take that stuff on juxtapositions and you look at something like central place theory and look at where central place theory was tested, right? Iowa. Why is it so beautiful in Iowa? Why does it, spring out this regular spacing of settlements? A particular conjuncture of circumstances, right? The whole conquest of the American West, monoculture, those two items, right? There was a particular global conjuncture that made hog and corn farming in Iowa possible. And then it took off. There was there were certain sort of positive feedbacks. There's a local knowledge about corn. There's a local knowledge about hog raising. The state extension agencies, the state agricultural department specializes in that stuff, right? That's the fundamental basis. The sort of uniformity of it all, right? That's where you get this regular spacing. You get a regular spacing of population on the basis of this agriculture. Then you get the regular spacing of settlements. So my point is that I think there are connections. There are serious connections to be made between the work that the spatial quantitative geographers are doing and what some of the critical human geographers are talking about. So anyway, but bottom line, critical human geography, I think, is now quite dominant, and it's a reflection of the way in which the discourse of human geography has become permeated by questions of power. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think critical human geography, though, I would like to see it more open to what geographers have done in the past.
Okay, and if you, Professor Barnett, if you want to comment something, but you have the question, that question. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess where I started was that. I mean, I think Kevin's right. I think in a certain sense, if you wander through all those rooms, everybody's doing certainly. I mean, I actually think there's a conceptual thing that politics and power aren't the same thing. That, leaving that, everybody in geography, certainly in British geography departments, and broadly speaking, I suspect in US ones as well, would think of themselves doing a version of, their recourse would be, well, everything's political. Power is infused everything, and it becomes a bit of a cliche. Interesting question. So the interesting question in relation to that question asked is the degree to which political geography within those fields might still. I mean, it's not an enclave, but I think actually for particular reasons, political geography might be quite attached to still. I think that an awful lot of political geography is still a bit hung up by not being international relations, in a way in which I don't think cultural geography is hung up by not being cultural studies. So I think there's interesting disciplinary, interdisciplinary shapes. But generally speaking, political geography is only one of the subdisciplines, certainly, and I think the shared worlds that Kevin and I inhabit, in which you'd go to find people talking about politics and democracy and state and territory. You'd go elsewhere. You'd go to cultural geography. You'd go to the urban places. Increase all of the work in, certainly in UK geography departments, enormous amount of work now, which is shaped by science and technology studies, by actor network theory, which is about the nature of knowledge economies. All of that work's about not only power, but it's about states and territories and stuff. So you can find that all over the place, and that might be a challenge for how particular subdisciplines think of themselves, if they think of themselves as being about the political, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for both lectures. It was amazing. So many things to debate and to think about it. I'm pretty sure new questions people are gonna have, especially after we have the subtitle in Portuguese. Gonna be more open for everybody in Brazil to watch it again and again, because there are so many things in the things you said. So we need to listen and think about it over and over again. So I would like to say thank you again, because you accept our invitation to this lecture. We are so far, but now we have to enjoy it, if I can say that, if this crazy word, but we have to enjoy something that we can do, right? So that's what we can do. We can be together in virtual life, right? So I say thank you in the name of a lot of professors in Brazil that's behind me in this moment planning this event. So thank you a lot. I want to give you some minutes to your final comments, if you want, of course. So I want to start with Professor Barnett, then Professor Cox, and then finally finish it. So again, thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I should just thank you ever so much, all of you, for inviting me and for putting it together. It's been lovely to see and talk to Kevin, which you might not have known that we sort of know each other. That's been lovely as well. But it's been oddly, I think, Daniel, it's kind of course because of the circumstances we've all been in the last 6 months. It might be a lot more normal than it would have been if we were doing it a year ago. We kind of talking to people we've never met from a long way away. Hey, what's new and different about that? But I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed kind of the challenge of thinking of what to say and of how to say what I said. I've enjoyed the conversation and the questions. Thank you ever so much for all of the questions. And it would be lovely if we could kind of maintain some sort of communication. I'd very much like to know more about what politics and political geography means in Brazil and related worlds. So thank you so much.
I echo those thoughts. I too enjoyed putting together my stuff. One of the reasons I like to do this sort of thing is that I learned so much. I sent my paper to Daniel, but I can see now it needs rewriting. Not a total rewrite, but I'm going to change some things where I feel uneasy. I think it can be more coherent. So I really appreciate these occasions, and I'm very grateful that you invited me. it is nice to see Clive. Clive and I, we've met from time to time. We know each other quite well. And so it's, in fact, we go back a long time, I think, Clive. Right?
I don't think we've ever been in the political geography room together, though, technically.
No, that's right. That's funny. Good. Okay. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for everybody who's listening to us. Next week, we're going to have a virtual meeting with 3 French professors. So we're going to be in a French language. And of course, after we're going to subtitle it again in Portuguese so everybody understand it. So we invite everybody to be together again next week, the same time, so you can see a new, different perspectives from different professors. Next week, next Thursday at 3 p.m. Brasilia time. So I have to change in the time zones. So yeah. Thanks again, Professor Kevin Cox. Thanks again, Professor Clive Barnett. And we hope to have you here in Brazil someday.
That would be lovely.
Yeah, when this world become normal again. I don't know what's normal, but Okay. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.